At 5:47 the next morning, James bolted upright in bed at the sound of diesel engines. Running barefoot to his backyard in pajamas, he watched in horror as massive excavators positioned themselves upstream. By the time he reached the site, silt had already begun clouding the once clear water. The foreman, a burly man with a clipboard, merely handed James a laminated copy of a work order signed by the Oakwood Heights Executive Board and continued directing his crew. By sunset, the creek no longer flowed. In its place lay a muddy gash in the earth, where stranded minnows flocked in shrinking puddles and confused birds pecked at the suddenly exposed creek bed. "Progress isn't pretty in its intermediate stages," Harold commented cheerfully from behind designer sunglasses when James confronted him at the construction site. "You've been invited to the ribbon-cutting ceremony next month. We'll even name one of the decorative bridges after you if that helps." His laughter echoed over the roar of the machinery as he walked away, phone already pressed to his ear. He's violated Section 7.3, Article 12, Paragraph 4, subsections A through F, and that's just before breakfast, Elena Garcia declared, slapping a highlighted copy of the HOA bylaws onto James's kitchen table. 3 empty coffee pots testified to the all-night strategy session among the creek-adjacent neighbors. Elena, who had once successfully sued the governor over wetland protection violations, had transformed James's dining room into a war room. Maps of the watershed pinned to walls, property deeds spread across the table, and a whiteboard titled "Taking Down Harold" dominated the space. "Did you know?" Sarah Johnson interjected, scrolling through county records on her laptop, that Harold tried to pull this exact same stunt in Meadowbrook Estates before moving here. They ran him out of town when he attempted to drain their community pond to build a private putting green. James had spent the night reviewing his property documents with a flashlight after Harold's crew had mysteriously cut power to his block. The creek was explicitly protected. Modifications required approval from 2/3 of all homeowners, not just Harold's puppet board. "We need to move fast," James said, pointing to drone photos he'd taken that morning. "They've already diverted the water into underground pipes, feeding directly to Harold's property. The creek bed will be completely dry by tomorrow." The trio divided responsibilities. Elena would handle legal action, Sarah would manage communications, and James would build community support. By dawn, they created a battle plan that would make military strategists proud. Within 48 hours, James had personally visited all 112 homes in Oakwood Heights. The response shocked him. Even residents who typically avoided neighborhood drama were outraged once they understood what was happening. Mr. Chen, who had never attended an HOA meeting in 20 years, offered his commercial printing services. The Abernathy sisters, both retired school teachers in their 80s, volunteered their extensive records of neighborhood history, proving the creek had been protected since the community's founding in 1973. Sarah's media background proved invaluable as she created Save Our Stream, a multi-platform campaign that quickly went viral. Her dramatic drone footage showing the muddy wound where the creek had been, contrasted with before videos of children playing in the clear water, sparked outrage well beyond Oakwood Heights. By day 3, 3 local news stations had covered the story. Elena discovered Harold had skipped not just HOA procedural requirements, but violated 6 county ordinances and 2 state environmental laws. More disturbing, the construction company was owned by Harold's brother-in-law and had previously been fined for illegal dumping. Harold's counterattack was both predictable and bizarre. Violation notices rained down like confetti. Mrs. Peterson received a fine for excessive bird feeding, the Williams family for unapproved shade of white paint, and most absurdly, James himself for creation of an unauthorized dead zone, in reference to his now dry creek bed. When fines failed to deter the rebellion, Harold escalated. Residents awoke one morning to find men in tactical-style uniforms patrolling the streets. Their vehicles bore the logo of Winstead Security Solutions, a company that, unsurprisingly, shared an address with Harold's previous business ventures. "They followed my daughter home from school," reported an enraged Mr. Takahashi, at the next creek liberation meeting, claimed they were monitoring potential vandals because she was carrying poster board for a school project. The security guards concentrated around the dam site, where Harold had accelerated construction despite mounting legal challenges. Concrete was poured at night, trees removed without permits, and an elaborate pump system installed leading directly to Harold's property. The community's breakthrough came from an unexpected ally, Harold's gardener. Disgruntled after being stiffed on payment, he provided Elena with Harold's actual architectural plans, which differed dramatically from those presented to the HOA. The real design showed a private lake exclusively on Harold's enlarged property, with the remaining creek bed converted to a storm drain. Elena immediately forwarded these documents to her contacts at the County Environmental Office and Water Authority. Within hours, 3 official vehicles rolled into Oakwood Heights, emergency lights flashing. The county inspector didn't just issue a stop work order, he brought uniformed officers who strung bright yellow, environmental CUIMEC tape around the entire construction area. The water commissioner arrived minutes later with an emergency injunction, while news helicopters circled overhead. That evening, as Harold was filmed being escorted to a county vehicle for questioning, residents gathered along the creek bed. In a moment of perfect symbolic timing, the sky opened up in a tremendous thunderstorm, the first rain in weeks. Water began to pool in the creek once more as the makeshift dam started to fail, nature already reclaiming what had been taken. The special HOA election transformed the Oakwood Heights Community Center into something between a rock concert and a religious revival. Residents arrived hours early, forming a line that wrapped around the building twice. Volunteers served coffee and homemade pastries, while children ran around with blue ribbons representing the creek tied to their wrists. Harold was conspicuously absent, as were his board members, though his presence was felt in the form of a last-minute fly campaign warning of plummeting property values and mosquito-borne diseases if the creek restoration proceeds. The pamphlets, printed on expensive glossy paper, were promptly repurposed as coloring sheets for the children's activity table. The voting took 17 minutes. The counting, overseen by representatives from the county election board, invited by Elena as a precaution, took 23 minutes. The results were unanimous, except for 4 ballots cast by the Winsteads and Petersons. I hereby accept the position of HOA president with one condition, James announced to thunderous applause. That you all understand this is a temporary role for me. Our goal isn't to replace one power structure with another, but to create a truly democratic system where this can never happen again. The newly elected board's first official meeting lasted until 2 a.m. as they drafted emergency measures. The dam removal would begin immediately. The security guards, who had been camping in Harold's driveway since the county investigation began, were banned from the neighborhood. And most importantly, a complete revision of the HOA bylaws would be undertaken with input from every household. At dawn the next morning, James stood with county environmental officials as heavy machinery, this time with proper permits, began carefully dismantling Harold's dam. The process would be delicate. Simply destroying it could cause flooding and further ecological damage. It's like surgery, explained Dr. Lopez, the ecology professor who had volunteered to oversee the restoration. We're not just removing a dam, we're healing a watershed. What happened next surprised everyone. As word spread about the restoration project, Oakwood Heights became an impromptu case study in community environmental rehabilitation. A nearby university sent ecology students to document the process. Environmental nonprofits offered resources and expertise. Neighboring communities, inspired by Oakwood Heights' stand, began examining their own watercourses. Instead, as the last barrier was lifted, a surprisingly strong surge of clear water pushed through the opening. Decades of underground springs, temporarily blocked by Harold's construction, had created a reservoir of pressure that now sent water coursing down the ancient creek bed. Children shrieked with delight as the water rushed past, carrying away months of dust and debris. Within hours, the creek was flowing merrily through the neighborhood once more, finding its way along familiar contours. The aftermath brought unexpected consequences. County auditors, investigating Harold's finances after the Water Authority filed charges, discovered he had misappropriated HOA funds to finance his private water feature. Criminal charges followed, and Harold's distinctive gold-trimmed SUV was replaced by a county sheriff's vehicle parked outside his mansion. When Harold and his wife fled town in the middle of the night, leaving behind unpaid contractors and a half-empty house, few were surprised. Their for sale sign lasted exactly 1 day before being replaced by a foreclosure notice. The ultimate irony came when the bank hired James's architectural firm to redesign the property's elaborate landscaping to be more water efficient and environmentally sound. The new HOA bylaws, ratified in a celebration that coincidentally marked the 6-month anniversary of the creek's rebirth, included unprecedented environmental protections, term limits for board members, and transparency requirements that became a model for communities throughout the state. 1 year later, on a perfect autumn morning, over 300 people gathered for the first annual Flow Freely Festival. The creek, now fully restored and enhanced with native plantings, bubbled happily through the neighborhood. Educational booths explained the interconnected watershed system. Children participated in citizen science projects cataloging aquatic insects, and teenagers led ecology tours highlighting the remarkable recovery of the ecosystem. The festival culminated in the dedication of Confluence Bridge, an elegant wooden footbridge connecting the community's trail system across the widest part of the creek. Designed by James and built by neighborhood volunteers, the bridge included a time capsule containing creek stones, newspaper articles about the conflict, and letters from residents to future generations explaining what the water meant to them. As sunset painted the water with golden light, James stood on the bridge alongside Elena, Sarah, and Eleanor Abernathy, who had insisted on being first across despite her walker. "You know what bothers me the most?" Eleanor mused, watching children play in the shallow water below. Harold never understood what actually increases property values. It was never about fancy ponds or gates or rules. "It's this," she continued, gesturing toward the families scattered along the banks, the neighbors chatting on blankets, the teenagers teaching younger children how to skip stones. Community, connection, something that flows between us all, like the water itself. Below them, a young girl shrieked with delight as she discovered a tiny crawfish hiding beneath a creek stone, the first seen since the dam's removal. Her parents, newcomers who had purchased their home specifically because of that creek with the amazing story, captured the moment on camera. James smiled, remembering how just 18 months ago he had stood in the same spot, staring at dusty emptiness where life had flourished for generations. Some scars in the landscape remained visible to his trained eye, erosion that would take years to fully heal, trees that hadn't survived the drought. But the water flowed on, persistent and patient. In time, even those marks would fade, replaced by new growth and fresh stories. The creek would remain, carrying away the memory of Harold Winstead, like just another fallen leaf in its currents, temporary, forgotten, and ultimately irrelevant to its ancient journey. Asterisk, the end asterisk. He didn't file a single permit, Elena explained during a strategy meeting now attended by over 40 neighbors crowded into James's living room. The county inspector nearly had a stroke when I showed him the photos. Harold's response came swiftly. Bright orange, violaati. Notices appeared on the doors of anyone suspected of opposing him. The Garcias returned from work to find their fence had been measured and deemed 3/4 of an inch above regulation height, carrying a $2,500 fine. The Johnson's Garden Gnome Collection was declared excessive lawn ornamentation. The emergency HOA meeting Harold called that Friday turned into something resembling a medieval peasant uprising. The community center overflowed as residents spilled out into the parking lot. "This is a cut and dried matter," Harold declared, his practiced smile now strained at the edges. "The improvements are already underway. Anyone interfering will face daily fines of $500. Eleanor Abernathy, aged 84, and using a walker, rose shakily to her feet. "Young man, she said in the steely voice that had terrified fifth graders for 4 decades. "I taught your type in school. Bullies don't last long in Oakwood Heights." The crowd erupted in applause as Harold banged his gavel ineffectually. As residents left the meeting, James didn't just pass out flyers. He handed out actual creek stones, each labeled with a time and date. 7 p.m. tomorrow, his backyard. The smooth stones passed from hand to hand like precious artifacts, which, James realized, they now were. The crowd that gathered in James's backyard looked less like a neighborhood meeting and more like a scene from Braveheart with better snacks. 137 residents, representing nearly every household in Oakwood Heights, stood around the dusty creek bed, illuminated by lanterns and righteous indignation. "Welcome to the first meeting of the Creek Liberation Front," James announced, standing on his deck as residents settled onto folding chairs, picnic blankets, and makeshift benches. The once burbling creek bed below lay silent, a ghostly reminder of what they'd lost. Elena Garcia took center stage, her prosecutor's voice carrying clearly without amplification. "Harold violated 16 separate provisions of our bylaws," she began, projecting documents onto a hastily hung bedsheet. "But that's just the appetizer in this buffet of illegality." The crowd gasped as Elena revealed her findings. Harold had diverted the water not just to create his vanity pond, but had installed underground irrigation systems, sending water exclusively to his property, all while claiming the project was for community benefit. Worse, soil samples from the construction site contained traces of industrial chemicals from previous development projects, which explained why Harold had rushed the work without permits. "We have 3 legal pathways," Elena computed: HOA by law enforcement, environmental regulatory action, and criminal charges for water theft and contamination. "Why choose?" called out Eleanor Abernathy, brandishing her walking cane like a cavalry sword. "I say we pursue all 3 and add a class action lawsuit for emotional distress. My blood pressure medication costs have doubled since that man moved here." As the cheering subsided, residents broke into action teams with military efficiency. The tech-savvy teens created a secure communication network outside Harold's monitoring. The retired judge living on Maple Lane drafted legal documents. The college environmental science professor collected water and soil samples with chain of custody documentation. James coordinated the petition drive, creating a mobile signature station that traveled door to door to accommodate work schedules and mobility issues. Sarah Johnson's media campaign expanded, with residents sharing personal stories of what the creek meant to them. The most viral, 6-year-old Zoe Garcia's tearful video asking, "Where did all the tadpoles go?" which racked up over 2 million views. The morning fog had just begun to lift when James Parker discovered the body floating in his creek. Fortunately, it was just a mannequin, a prank by neighborhood teenagers celebrating Halloween. James laughed as he waded into the cold water to retrieve it, his boots sinking into the familiar silt. This wasn't the first strange thing he pulled from his beloved creek in 15 years at Oakwood Heights. James's modest ranch-style home sat at the quietest edge of the upscale subdivision, but what it lacked in square footage, it made up for with the crystal-clear creek that meandered through his backyard. The previous owner, an eccentric botanist, had cultivated the banks with native plants that now created a stunning riparian ecosystem. "Morning, Creek Whisperer," Elena Garcia called over the fence, her 4-year-old twins already begging to help with the mannequin extraction. The Garcias and the Johnsons, whose properties also featured the creek, had an unspoken competition for who could spot the most wildlife. Last week, Elena's daughter had photographed a blue heron catching a fish, trumping James's fox sighting. The creek wasn't just their private paradise. During summer, it transformed into the neighborhood's unofficial community center, with children constructing elaborate dam systems while parents chatted in lawn chairs, toes dipped in the cool water. James, an architectural engineer who worked from home, had even designed a series of non-invasive stepping stones that created safe crossing points. This slice of nature had been explicitly protected in their property deeds, a stipulation James had his lawyer triple-check before signing. Despite his instinctive wariness of HOAs, Oakwood Heights had maintained a hands-off approach to the creek for years. That changed dramatically when Harold Winstead arrived, a former hedge fund manager with a failed political career. Harold swept into the HOA presidency with promises of elevating property values through aggressive community redesign. Within weeks of taking office, he'd begun eyeing the creek with the calculating stare of a man who saw nature as something to be conquered rather than preserved. "I call this my Versailles view," Harold Winstead announced, gesturing expansively from his third-floor balcony. His sprawling pseudo-Georgian mansion, which locals had nicknamed Mount Winstead, loomed over the neighborhood like an architectural bullying. James had reluctantly accepted Harold's invitation to discuss community matters, only to find himself trapped in what felt like a real estate sales pitch. "Beautiful creek you have there," Harold remarked with unsettling possessiveness, pointing toward James's property. "Shame about its untamed condition." Harold had arrived in Oakwood Heights after a scandal at his investment firm, something involving client funds and a yacht that had been hushed up with settlements. He'd immediately purchased the largest home in the community, installed gold-plated mailbox posts, violating 3 different HOA rules, and begun his campaign for HOA presidency with promises of making Oakwood Heights the premier address in the county. His first 6 months in office had been a blitzkrieg of petty tyranny: $500 fines for trash cans left out 6 minutes past collection, mandatory approved shrub species lists, and a bizarre 42-page document on acceptable holiday light configurations. But most residents, busy with careers and families, simply paid the occasional fine and carried on. The May HOA meeting changed everything. James arrived late, due to a work call, and found the community center packed. Unusual for these typically deserted meetings, on a large easel stood architectural renderings of what appeared to be a resort-style lake. "And so," Harold was saying as James slipped into a back row seat, "this Oakwood Lagoon project will increase property values by an estimated 20%, while providing a sophisticated entertainment venue for resident use." James stared in disbelief at the renderings. The creek, his creek, had been dammed to create a massive pond directly behind Harold's property, complete with a private dock extending from Harold's yard. The remaining creek bed downstream was depicted filled with decorative white stones and what appeared to be artificial plants. When James objected, pointing out the ecological impact and clear property rights violations, Harold's smile never wavered. "Your concerns have been noted and dismissed," Harold replied, his voice dripping with condescension. The board vote was unanimous. Construction begins tomorrow. The board, James later discovered, now consisted solely of Harold, his wife, who held the title of treasurer despite a pending investigation for tax fraud in their previous state, and the Petersons, a couple who had moved in 3 months ago and who, coincidentally, were investors in Harold's new consulting business.